has big Bodhi Day plans today, right? Yeah. All good? All right, good morning.
Good morning.
So today on our calendar, anyway, is Bodhi Day, the Buddha's awakening and enlightenment, which a number of us here, celebrated and practiced Friday night uh, for a couple of hours. So my talk today is about the Buddha's awakening and Bodhi Day. So I want to start with, I have a few different readings today throughout the talk, a little bit more than usual, but I'll talk about why as we go along. But the first one is from a text called the Buddha Karita in praise of the Buddha's acts, which was, it's an epic poem that was about the life of Gautama, the Buddha, that was attributed to Asvaghosha in the 2nd century. So a very old text is part of some of the Buddha's canons. And this chapter is chapter 14. It's entitled Enlightenment. And this chapter starts after Gautama's defeat of Mara, which in a lot of the awakening stories we read and remember and recite year after year, that's usually a really prominent part of that story, which is often focused on. But today, I want to focus after Mara's defeat and there. So this starts here. After the Bodhisattva had subdued Mara, his determination was firmer and his mind tranquil. The eternal end being most meaningful, he entered the profound and fine trances. Sovereign in the samadhis, he would realize them in due order. During the first watch, he entered concentration and remembered his past lives. From such and such a place, called so and so, I came to be reborn here. That way, he completely understood his hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of births and deaths. The births and deaths he had experienced were countless. All kinds of living beings had all been in his family once, and he had great compassion in his heart. Having recollected with great compassion, he further observed that living beings revolved in 6 destinations, and that their births and deaths never ended. The 6 destinations were false and not firm at all, like a plantain tree or an illusion. In the second watch, he then obtained the pure divine eye. Seeing all beings, it was as if he observed their images in a mirror. As beings generated births and deaths, they were noble or low, poor or rich. According to their pure or impure actions, they experienced painful or happy retributions. He observed that evildoers would be reborn in woeful destinations, and that those who practiced wholesome actions would be reborn among humans or gods. If they were reborn in hell, they experienced countless kinds of suffering. I'm going to skip about 2 pages because Asvaghosha goes on for 2 pages to talk about all the bad things that happen in hell. That's how bad being reborn in hell really is. So if you're interested what that's like, you can look at this after. So skipping ahead. Then, during the third watch, he entered profound concentration and observed that the suffering of the turning of the wheel in the world was its specific nature. One is frequently reborn, grows old, and dies. The number of rebirths is countless. Desire and the darkness of delusion, no one knows how to escape them. In his right mindfulness, he inwardly considered the origination of birth and death. He knew with certainty that old age and death had to be brought about by birth. If a person has a body, for that reason, physical pain must follow. He further observed how birth was caused, and he saw that it was through the action of existence. His divine eye observed that the action of existence was not produced by any god. It had no specific nature and no self, and neither was it without a cause. If one cuts through the first knot of the bamboo, the other knots then pose no difficulty. After he had seen the cause of birth and death, he gradually saw the truth. The action of existence was produced by grasping, as when fire consumes firewood. Grasping had craving as its cause, just as a small fire may set a mountain ablaze. Goes on for another page and a half, going through all the 12 links of dependent origination. And then fast forwarding, the Eightfold Path, right view, and so on, is a smooth, level, and right road. In the end, there is no I or mine, just as fire is extinguished when the firewood is consumed. What I had to do is done. I have obtained the path of right awakening of our ancestors. The Buddha had completely achieved the highest meaning and entered the house of the greatest seer. As darkness passed and the light rose, movement and tranquility were both silent. He had reached the law without end, and his omniscience was clear. The virtue of a great seer was pure, and the earth quaked all around. The whole universe was clear and bright, and gods, dragons, and spirits gathered in great numbers. In the sky, they played celestial music to worship the law. A gentle breeze brought coolness, and celestial clouds brought fragrant rain. Fine flowers blossomed out of season, and sweet fruits became ripe in spite of the season. I'll stop that reading there from Asvagoda's Buddha Karita. So a couple things. You might be wondering, if you've heard the story before, why I wanted to fast forward and skip over the part of the Buddha's encounter with Mara, since it's such a prominent feature of the Buddha's story. So for the last couple of weeks, I was kind of steeped in Siddhartha's story up to his awakening, and looking at all kinds of different sources, and having read and studied and practiced this path for a while. That was it's a really important part of the story. And I talked about Mara about a year ago in my more recent talks. But rereading this after that part, there are a few new kind of things that caught my attention after however many years of reading the story over and over. So that's what I wanted to focus on today, were these other things that became anew for me this year in reading this story again. And the first was remembering that after the Buddha's defeat of Mara, all these armies. If you've seen the movie The Little Buddha with Keanu Reeves, or some other stories or depictions, it's very colorful, a lot of metaphor, a lot of legend and mythology, these vast illustrations and descriptions of all these armies of Mara firing all these weapons, and this great war and battle that was waged. Mara's armies are metaphors that stand in for some of our own very real human experiences, like sensual pleasures, discontent, hunger and thirst, craving, laziness, fear and doubt, conceit and ingratitude, self-praise and disparaging others. These were the things that the Buddha had to grapple with as he was sitting under the Bodhi tree. And teacher and I were talking a few minutes before service, trying to see if we knew or remembered, how long did the Buddha actually sit under the tree? How long did it take, this whole process take? And we don't know if there's any really consensus, and different schools have different thoughts on it. Could be anywhere from a single night, like we practiced Friday night, and kind of symbolically tried to emulate that story and that legend. Other schools believe could be several days or weeks that Siddhartha was sitting there determined not to move until he realized his true nature and all of that. So after Mara's defeat is when that reading comes in. He enters into this deep meditative absorption, the jhanas, or these meditative trances. And when the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and this key Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, these 12 links that start with ignorance and go all the way through to suffering, of how we get caught in this realm of samsara, this realm of suffering, subject to rebirth. So that's really a really important part of the story that sometimes we kind of gloss over because Mara's battle is so colorful and action packed. It's like going to see a movie or something. When you go for the action movie and the art house drama has like 5 people in the theater, right? It's not the sexiest part of the story, but probably the most important part of the story, right? So the meditative absorption, these 3 knowledges, and this insider discovery around the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the law of dependent origination. So all that happens, and he wakes up, right? Becomes enlightened, becomes the Buddha. There are more sources that talk about how he continues to sit there after his awakening for some period of time, and there's more one can find about this. And this, again, ranges anywhere from a few weeks all the way up to 7 weeks or 49 days, which is interesting because I don't know if the number 49 is necessarily an auspicious number in a lot of traditions or even in Buddhism. But it had me thinking around our something like about the Bardo state in the intermediate state between births, and how in a lot of traditions, including Korean and Japanese and Chinese traditions, the funeral and memorial services typically extend for at least 49 days. So interesting kind of, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not there, but anyway, part of the story goes that the Buddha continued to sit under various trees, not just one tree. If you see that for a number of weeks to savor this enlightenment. And some other things happen too, which I maybe learned for the first time. So in the 4th week after enlightenment, and this is probably legend, right? It said that he created a beautiful jeweled chamber sitting in meditation, and this jeweled chamber, this treasure, it became what later is known as the Abhidharma, one of the baskets of the Tripitaka, the philosophical and psychological commentaries and treatises and things like that. So one part of our 3-part basket, and that his mind was so purified that 6 colored rays came out of his body: blue, yellow, red, white, orange, and a mixture of these, which coincidentally make up the Buddhist flag. If you've seen the Buddhist flag, that's where those colors and the flag come from, is from these legends and stories after his enlightenment, which is very interesting. You can see them in many Buddhist temples there. Another interesting thing I found in this post-awakening period was that while Mara's armies, this personification of death or evil, and these temptations and these afflictions of the mind, actually came back. Mara's daughters, Mara said to have 3 daughters, Tana, Rati, and Raga, thirst, aversion, and lust, actually came back and tried again to tempt the Buddha after this time. So Mara doesn't disappear, doesn't go away. In fact, there's other stories that Mara comes back several times throughout the Buddha's life to try to question and challenge his enlightenment. So it's not a one and done. This great war, it's not over at that time. Mara continues to exist. Interestingly, in this part of what I was looking up, Mara also has 3 sons, which bonus points if anybody knew that. Vibrama, Harsa, and Darpa, confusion, gaiety, and pride, apparently. So next time you're at You have Buddhist trivia at pub night. just in case that question comes up, you now know and are prepared for it, right? And some of the other iconography and images you sometimes see of the Buddha in different cultural contexts, probably more so in Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Cambodia, and places like that. Sometimes you see an image of the Buddha sitting, and he has a giant kind of cobra or snake behind him. Maybe you've seen that. And part of the story goes in that post Enlightenment period, there's a great rain that came down. This huge king cobra came out to shield and protect him and serve as kind of an umbrella and keep him warm. So if you ever see other depictions and in Buddha's art, and you see a big snake behind the Buddha, that's where that comes from. And the last thing, usually when we talk about the Buddha's enlightenment story, he becomes awakened, and then he goes back to the deer park and gives his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel, to his 5 former monk friends that abandoned him when he chose the middle path and to give up the ascetic practices. But before that, the first 2 followers of the Buddha were 2 lay people, 2 merchants that encountered the Buddha in this post-enlightenment period. Tapusa and Balika came and offered him some food to break his post-awakening fast, and they became the first disciples of the Buddha, which were lay followers and not monks, which I think is also very, very interesting to know. So a little Buddhist trivia for you there. On Friday night, Hato Sunem read a few excerpts from this book, Karen Armstrong's Buddha, which if you haven't read this yet or picked this up, this is a very good read and goes over the entire life of the Buddha and gives a very good understanding of Buddhist philosophy and practice. So I wanted to read a little bit from this as well, different parts than what we heard on Friday night. So this I'm going to start here. I kind of pieced this together, so it jumps around a little bit, but it starts in her chapter 3 on enlightenment. He sat down, tradition has it, under a Bodhi tree and took up the meditation position, vowing that he would not leave the spot until he had attained nirvana. This pleasant grove is now known as Bodh Gaya and is an important site of pilgrimage because it is thought to be the place where Gautama experienced his awakening. It was this spot that he became a Buddha. They say that Gautama mused upon the deeply conditional nature of all life as we know it, saw all his past lives, and recovered that secluded and solitary state he'd experienced as a child. He then slipped easily into the first jhana, or meditative trance, and progressed through even higher states of consciousness until he gained an insight that forever transformed him and convinced him that he had freed himself from the round of samsara and rebirth, which were the 4 Noble Truths and Eightfold Path. There seems nothing strikingly original about these truths. Most of the monks and ascetics of North India would have agreed with the first 3, and Gautama himself had been convinced of them since the very beginning of his quest. If there is anything novel, it was the 4th truth, in which Gautama proclaimed that he had found a way to enlightenment, a method which he called the Noble Eightfold Path. If there is any truth to the story that Gautama gained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in a single night, it could be that he acquired a sudden, absolute certainty that he really had discovered a method that would, if followed energetically, bring an earnest seeker to Nibbana. He had not made this up. It was not a new creation or an invention of his own. On the contrary, he always insisted that he had simply discovered a path of great antiquity, an ancient trail, traveled by human beings in a far-off, distant era. The other Buddhas, his predecessors, had taught this path an immeasurably long time ago, but this ancient knowledge had faded over the years and had been entirely forgotten. Gautama insisted that this insight was simply a statement of things as they really are. The path was written into the very structure of existence. It was therefore the Dharma, par excellence, because it elucidated the fundamental principles that govern the life of the cosmos. If men, women, animals, and gods kept to this path, they could all attain an enlightenment that would bring them peace and fulfillment, because there was no longer struggling against their deepest grain. The Buddha never claimed that this knowledge of the Four Noble Truths was unique, but that he was the first person in this present era to have realized them and made them a reality in his own life. He found that he had extinguished the craving, hatred, and ignorance that hold humanity in thrall. He had attained nibbana. And even though he was still subject to physical ailments and other vicissitudes, nothing could touch his inner peace or cause him serious mental pain. His method had worked. The holy life has been lived out to its conclusion, he cried out triumphantly at the end of that momentous night under the Bodhi tree. What had to be done has been accomplished. There is nothing else to do. So, what did the new Buddha mean when he claimed to have reached Nibbana on that spring night? Had he himself, as the word implied, been snuffed out, extinguished like a candle flame? During his 6-year quest, Gautama had not masochistically courted annihilation, but had sought enlightenment. He had wanted to wake up to his full potential as a human person, not to be wiped out. Nibbana did not mean personal extinction. What had been snuffed out was not his personality, but the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. As a result, he enjoyed a blessed coolness and peace. By tamping out the unhelpful states of mind, the Buddha had gained the peace which comes from selflessness. It is a condition that those of us who are still enmeshed in the cravings of egotism, which make us hostile toward others and distort our vision, cannot imagine. That is why the Buddha always refused, in the years following his enlightenment, to define or describe nirvana. It would, he said, be improper to do so, because there are no words to describe such a state to an unenlightened person. The attainment of Nibbana did not mean that the Buddha would never experience any more suffering. He would grow old, get sick, and die like everybody else, and would experience pain while doing so. Nibbana does not give an awakened person trance-like immunity, but an inner haven which enables a man or woman to live with pain, to take possession of it, affirm it, and experience a profound peace of mind in the midst of suffering. Nibbana, therefore, is found within oneself, in the very heart of each person's being. It is an entirely natural state. It is not bestowed by grace, nor achieved for us by a supernatural savior. It can be reached by anybody who cultivates the path to enlightenment as energetically as Gautama did. Nibbana is a still center. It gives meaning to life. Once a person has learned to access this nucleus of calm, he or she is no longer driven by conflicting fears and desires and is able to face pain, sorrow, and grief with equanimity. An enlightened or awakened human being has discovered a strength within that comes from being correctly centered beyond the reach of selfishness. I probably read a few hundred pages out of dozens of different sources trying to put this together. And that was probably the best one that I found. So there you go. If you want to, the most easily accessible and understandable, in my opinion, the description of that and trying to contextualize it and make that understandable. Um, and interestingly, one of the last things um, that that I want to share here is another thing that happened after uh, the Buddha's um, the Buddha's enlightenment, after this post enlightenment period that he's sitting and meditating. Um, This next reading comes from the Majjhima Nikaya, so if you would, please put your hands on Hapchang. I considered this Dharma that I have attained is profound, hard to see and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, unattainable by mere reasoning, subtle, to be experienced by the wise. But this generation delights in attachment, takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth, namely, specific conditionality, dependent origination. And it is hard to see this truth, namely, the stilling of all formations, the relinquishing of all acquisitions, the destruction of craving, dispassion, cessation, nibbana. If I were to teach the Dharma, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. Thereupon came to me spontaneously these stanzas never heard before. Enough with teaching the Dharma that even I've found hard to reach, for it will never be perceived by those who live in lust and hate. Those died in lust, wrapped in darkness, will never discern this difficult Dharma, which goes against the worldly stream, subtle, deep, and difficult to see. Considering thus my mind inclined to inaction rather than to teaching the Dharma. So ends the reading. So to me, and all the things that I read in the story after the Buddha's awakening, that was probably one of the more striking kind of things to come across, that even after his awakening, to put it in kind of modern vernacular, saying, yeah, I don't think anybody else can get this, and that would really stress me out and make me tired to have to try to teach people this. This is tough stuff. There is doubt, right, and hesitation right after his awakening that nobody else can understand this. I can't teach this. People aren't going to get it. They're too wrapped up in themselves. They can't hear this. I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. He had to be convinced by a God that came down and said, you need to teach this. And then he said, yeah, I guess you're right. A little bit further, I'll tiptoe into his first sermon that I said he went back to the deer park, and the story goes he went back, awakened, enlightened, went back to his 5 monk friends that had abandoned him when he gave up the ascetic practices and delivered his first sermon, turning the wheel. But did you know he went to his friends, was telling them, hey, I got it. I'm awake. I'm enlightened. I got the path. I got the Noble Eightfold Path. 3 times his friends said, nah, we think you're full of BS. You gave up the ascetic life and you went to this life of luxury, eating food and all that. They said, no. It took him 3 times to convince his former monk friends to listen. So I think that's another really interesting part of the story too. And then one of the monk friends, Kundana, upon hearing once they listened and heard his first sermon, he immediately entered what's called a sotapanna, or became a stream enterer, and was enlightened 5 days later when he heard the second sermon. So very, very interesting Buddha's enlightenment pub trivia for you. And then I'll end with this. This is from the Dhammapada in chapter 11 on age. And some sources have it, these are the first words that came to the Buddha's mind after the moment of his awakening. I have gone through many rounds of birth and death, looking in vain for the builder of this body. Heavy indeed is birth and death, again and again. But now I have seen you, house builder. You shall not build this house again. Its beams are broken. Its dome is shattered. Self-will is extinguished. Nirvana is attained. Thank you so much.